What makes for a good mentor figure when it comes to anime and manga? Across many different fictional works, one of the most prolific archetypes is that of the teacher. Call it a mentor, a guide, a sensei, whatever you see fit. The idea of some character that serves as an influence on other characters' lives, teaching them to be better in whatever way they can. Especially when it comes to shonen, this is a very important archetype present in so many stories. And with this archetype being so prominent, of course, it's important to make sure this character is well written. But what makes these characters feel like the impactful, knowledgeable role models that they're supposed to be? I want to take a look at a few examples and specifically which aspects make them so great. This is sorta inspired by my video about writing the strongest archetype, and just like in that video, we can't cover everybody here. We're focused more on specific aspects of these characters rather than the characters themselves, and looking at what makes them pull off the archetype so well. More importantly, these are characters I'm more knowledgeable about and feel like I could do justice in covering. So if you're wondering why someone is excluded, it may be because I didn't want to cover the same points over and over, or because it's someone I don't feel like I could do justice in covering, or maybe I just don't know them. Like, you know the running joke on this channel that I still haven't watched Naruto? I'll get around to it eventually. But from what I've heard, there's two really good examples there. In all seriousness though, there are hundreds of these characters. I can't get them all. Even within one series, there might be multiple, and I'm more focused on the actual archetype itself, rather than the characters. There will be some spoilers for each series featured here, but they won't be major spoilers. Let's start with a story that has plenty of examples of this because it's based in a literal school setting, My Hero Academia. Many characters in the story take on this role, whether they're mentors, bosses, idols, or actual teachers. So I'll pick two in particular, All Might and Aizawa. All Might fulfills all of those roles I just mentioned. He's a mentor, he did lead an agency as a boss, and he is an actual school teacher. Of course, he's a symbol too. All Might does serve as a beacon of hope for society. In a sense, he's a mentor to society as a whole. He serves as a mentor on 3 different levels, an individual mentor for Deku, a teacher for the students at UA, and an inspiration for society as a whole. I touched upon this aspect of it in my video about the strongest archetype, which I will link above, but when it comes to this aspect, appearances are very important. In his role, it's made clear that this is the case, both as the #1 hero and as Deku's mentor. Both the idea of All Might and the physical appearances of him act as symbols. It may sound like I'm getting off topic pretty quickly too because this is the first character I'm covering, but no, this aspect of him applies to him fulfilling the mentor role as well. A good mentor or teacher should serve as a symbol for those whom they teach. There should be something they stand for, whether it's something small or something large scale like All Might being the symbol of peace for society. So, aspect #1 that I wanted to cover. A good mentor represents something. But on a smaller level, All Might's of course a great mentor for Deku. Another great aspect about him is the fact that he lets Deku make mistakes and perform his own discovery. He doesn't give Deku all the answers, at least not up front if it's something that All Might himself already knows. In cases like learning about the previous users of One For All, where even All Might doesn't know everything, he's happy to help out there. But if it's something he knows Deku can figure out on his own, he lets him do that. All Might knows Deku is capable of figuring things out on his own and growing on his own, and for the most part, he takes a very hands-off approach. Deku learns a lot of things about his power on his own, and same goes for him learning about being a hero. But still, he makes sure that he's supportive along the way. When necessary, he will step in and take a more proactive approach. There's a fine balance between giving his student independence as well as guidance. The former is needed for Deku to grow down the line, so he knows how to make his own decisions and grow on his own. But the latter is also needed to an extent to ensure that he has the tools for that. There's plenty of other things I could say about All Might as a teacher and a mentor, but the aspect of him that stands out most to me is the faith that he has in his students, particularly Deku. After all, he saw a lot of himself within Deku, both starting out as quirkless kids with huge ambition. So that's aspect #2. A good mentor will display huge faith in their students. As for Aizawa, his role is a lot more traditional as a teacher. He is a pro hero, but his most prominent role in the series is being a teacher at UA, specifically the homeroom teacher for 1A. He always has his students as a priority, but also makes it a point to not coddle them to prepare them for what they have to face, kind of like what I said with All Might. But to a greater extent, he gives his students a lot of autonomy. One of the best examples of his attitude as a mentor is how he treats Aoyama. This is something that was only animated pretty recently, so I'm not going to flat out spoil what happens here, in case there's someone that hasn't caught up yet. But there comes a point when Aizawa has to make a difficult decision, and while he has the complete authority to do something like that, he instead lets his students make the decision, showing that same trust in them that All Might showed. Aizawa might show tough love sometimes, but he clearly wants to ensure his students can flourish and also avoid what he had to go through as a student. Aizawa has done a great job teaching his students responsibility, as well as protecting them from losing fellow classmates. This is such an important thing to him because this all stems from his own personal experiences of losing a friend, with him and Present Mike having to deal with the fact that their friend died and eventually came back as something completely different. What Aizawa's students are going through is very different from what he went through, but there are still some similarities, just enough that Aizawa could teach from his own experience. And that's the third aspect of a great mentor figure I wanted to outline here. A good mentor could teach from their own experiences, making sure their students can avoid the pitfalls they encountered, even if it's something out of their hands. Next, we'll move on to Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball has no shortage of this archetype, so we're only going to focus on 3 specific characters. These 3 are each important to the story for a huge chunk of the series, and lessons they teach can be seen throughout. Others like Korin, Kami, King Kai, Whis, and even Maris for example, they fulfill this role really well, but just like I said at the beginning of the video, we can't cover everybody, just specific aspects of each character. So that's why I'm choosing 3 more prominent examples. The first one we have is Roshi, a really obvious choice. Roshi is the most stereotypical version of this role in Dragon Ball, and he clearly has inspired a lot of other characters like him in shonen. A wise old martial arts master who is quirky in a few ways, and unfortunately also perverted. But aside from that, the way he goes about training his students does show that he truly cares about ensuring their growth. Sure, physical training is involved, but look at the motto of his school: work hard, study well, and eat and sleep plenty. It's apparent he cares about their well-being to a great extent. Roshi also demonstrates his mastery in so many different ways. Amidst early Dragon Ball, he'd frequently display new and unique techniques, serving as a perfect example of how well-versed he is. Even with his old age, he manages to be a prominent martial artist, and it feels like he truly is a master of what he does. It's to the point where he even fights against Goku in disguise during the 21st World Tournament just to teach him again. There's always someone stronger, and this will give him the motivation to grow further, as well as making sure Goku won't get too ahead of himself even if he is powerful. That's a fourth aspect. When we're told one of these characters is a master of something, we aren't just told it, we're shown it too. We get a clear display of their knowledge and experience. The second Dragon Ball character I want to mention is Goku. Goku himself eventually did become a teacher. There's multiple people he plays this role for, and each to a different extent, but most notably is his role as Gohan's mentor. Gohan wasn't just his first child, but also his first true student. It's the first time Goku fully took up this role with somebody. Goku has his own shortcomings and isn't a perfect teacher, but it doesn't make him poorly written. If anything, it makes him feel like a more human example of this archetype, and I get the irony in saying that because he isn't a human. We could see this in the Cell Saga. He believes in Gohan, which is great, but it's to a fault. He has such high hopes for Gohan, his student, and his son, that he looks past Gohan's own shortcomings and what held him back. Goku's own flaws make him miss the flaws of his student. It doesn't make him a bad teacher, or a bad father for that matter, just overzealous. He's flawed, but not in a malicious or stupid way. Ultimately, he was right about Gohan too. He just went about it the wrong way. And really, it isn't his fault. Again, this is the first time Goku became a mentor. He never was a true mentor before. He had trained with Gohan after returning from Yardrat, but in the time chamber, he had to be a true mentor 100% focused on helping Gohan grow as a warrior, as well as training his own powers at the same time. That's why Piccolo picked up on what Goku couldn't see. He had actually mentored Gohan before and was aware of these things. Goku may have been biased and overlooked things due to him viewing Gohan solely as a son and not also his student at the same time. This aspect is optional and doesn't apply to every mentor figure. But aspect number 5 is that a good mentor character doesn't need to be perfect. They could be flawed too. Piccolo viewed Gohan in a completely different light. First, Gohan was just a student and a burden to him, but eventually he grew to be Gohan's friend. He's the third person I wanted to cover for Dragon Ball. In my opinion, Piccolo is the best example of this trope in Dragon Ball, but that's just me. Not only is he a great teacher, but he takes the cliche of the teacher becomes the student and pulls it off in his own great way. A good chunk of his character development is tied to the fact that he briefly became a teacher to Gohan. It's arguably the biggest turning point for him in the story overall. And yes, as cliche as it is, there are plenty of times when a mentor could learn just as much from their student as they are teaching the student. There are so many different ways to execute this, and Piccolo is a very unique example of it. The former arch nemesis of Goku, learning and growing by developing his first real friendship. Slowly going from a villain that reluctantly teamed up with Goku, to putting his life on the line for Gohan, and later down the line becoming a full-on ally to them. He learned friendship and compassion from Gohan. This sixth aspect kind of ties into the last aspect I mentioned. A mentor could learn from their student too. And while I don't want to devote a whole section to him, it's worth mentioning Vegeta even displays these traits too. Going forward, we might even see him start to take up this role more often. We've seen bits and pieces of it, with both versions of Trunks and even with Kappa, the latter of which is a really interesting relationship. Like I said, this series is full of characters that can fit this archetype, each to a different extent though. Next is my favorite example on this list, Reigen Arataka. He's not just my favorite character in Mob Psycho, which is full of great characters, but he's also a perfect subject to discuss when it comes to this video topic. By the standards of this archetype, he's very unique in a few ways, but also does display a lot of the desirable traits for a mentor that I've already outlined. Unlike most of the other mentors on this list, physically, Reigen doesn't amount to much. He doesn't have powers on the level of Mob's, and he doesn't help Mob grow physically. But none of that matters. He still manages to be a great mentor in the story. even with the fact that there are a lot of fights and Reigen is even involved in some of them. But it's not because he trains Mob physically or anything like that. It comes down to a pretty simple reason. Reigen is not just a good mentor, he's a great character. He's flawed and human. That's why he's so beloved, but also why he's such a good guide for Mob. First impressions of him might make it seem like he's using Mob, but it becomes very clear early on that he does know Mob very well and cares for him a lot. He gives Mob some great guiding principles in regards to how to use his powers, but more importantly, he very much does value Mob as a person, and the two of them are very similar. One example of how much he cares for Mob is in his first encounter with Claw, where he's cognizant of Mob's level of stress and how tough it is for him to face stressful situations, to the point where, unintentionally, he bears the burden of Mob's anger, saving everyone and fighting on Mob's behalf so he doesn't need to break his principles, and also doesn't need to get stressed out. It's especially important here when Mob is told not to use his powers to fight, even though in this situation it's life or death, and it's in self-defense too. He makes sure that Mob adheres to those principles no matter what, never using those psychic powers on others. Mob is talented as an Esper, but more importantly, he's just a kid trying to live his life. Reigen helps with a bunch of other stuff too. Mentors have many different ways of ensuring their mentees can succeed, and that doesn't always need to be focused on physical growth. Reigen pretty much does nothing to directly impact Mob's physical power. It's not like he teaches him how to use his powers better, or helps him grow his capacity, nothing. But he does a ton to affect Mob's growth as a person, and he's one of the biggest influences on Mob's life as a whole. And even though he doesn't directly improve Mob's power in any way, by being a mentor for this aspect of Mob's life, that actually does end up affecting his powers, considering it's tied to his emotions and personality. He teaches Mob how to be a better person, he gives him guidance, and the inverse is true as well. Good mentors or teachers should be focused on strengthening the mentality of their students. They could do this by helping them develop some set of morals and personal goals beyond raw strength. Even though Reigen can't fully teach Mob how to utilize his powers better or make him grow physically, ironically, the guidance that he gives him is the perfect type of guidance for him, given how intertwined his powers and identity are. You can see my video about Saitama and Mob for more on that. But like I said, a lot of the inverse is true too. At the same time, Reigen needs Mob just as much as the inverse. It's very apparent when Reigen has to work on his own for a bit. Reigen knows how to handle Mob's problems because he sees himself within Mob. His life without Mob in it is kind of what he thought Mob's life would be without him in it. Lonely, depressing, no sort of guidance or goals, no growth. No people who he could truly call friends, just people using him. And vice versa, him using others. His only social interaction came when people needed his help. He was only known for his advice and lacked any sort of real connection. Reigen fulfills this archetype so well because we see exactly where his knowledge and lessons stem from. We know what makes him tick as a person and as a mentor, as well as how important his connection to Mob is. I guess we can call that the seventh aspect, which is the fact that we should be able to understand where a mentor character is coming from and what drives them to do what they do, as well as why they're so good at it. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure also has its fair share of mentor characters. Of course, there's Will Zeppeli and Lisa. In a way, you can kind of consider Joseph that too, because he was sort of intended to be a guide for the Stardust Crusaders in Part 3, even though he's not a traditional mentor. All three of these characters align pretty well with this archetype, and we could even include others here, but there's one other person I want to focus on. In my eyes, the greatest example of this archetype in JoJo is Gyro, from Part 7. Not only does he serve as a deuteragonist, a rival, and a friend for Johnny, but by all accounts, he's Johnny's mentor. It's kinda easy to overlook, especially with all the crazy good stuff going on in this part, and because of their dynamic, but that is how their relationship started out. His dynamic with Johnny is really unique for that reason. He teaches Johnny many things, but at the end of the day, they're also equals and treat each other as such. A mentor doesn't necessarily have to be a character's superior. Being an equal to a character could be just as effective. It adds another unique element to their relationship too. We've covered other mentors that have separate relationships to their students, but usually that's through relation like Lisa and Joseph, or Goku and Gohan. This type of relationship as friends is something I feel isn't used too often for mentors. Of course, a lot of mentors are friends with their mentees, but in the sense that they're basically equals. Like I said, it's pretty easy to overlook the fact that Gyro is Johnny's mentor because it feels more like they're primarily friends over being master and student. But he still does manage to teach Johnny a lot along the way. In the grand scheme of things, this becomes a small portion of their relationship, and a smaller aspect of the overall story, but it still remains incredibly effective. This type of dynamic for a teacher and student opens up a bunch of potential for how the mentor can grow as an equal alongside the mentee, and that's an eighth aspect that works really well with mentor characters. Mentors don't just need to be a superior, they can just as easily be friends or equals. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, drop a like because that lets me know you want to see more like this. Jujutsu Kaisen also has its fair share of mentor characters. For example, Gojo often doesn't get a lot of credit as a teacher. I've seen quite a few takes where people say he's a shitty teacher, or that he doesn't care for his students. For what it's worth, I feel like he does fulfill this role pretty effectively. Although there are two other people in particular that I'd rather focus on here. Nanami is one of the most prolific role models in Yuji's life. He initially was pretty tough on Yuji, but he grew to understand Yuji and how he acted, and tried to guide him down the path to being a better sorcerer, teaching him the cruel realities of the world around him. Of course, Yuji had seen some pretty crazy things already, but Nanami gave him his first glimpse into the morality of being a sorcerer, giving him a roadmap for what to expect going forward. Like I mentioned, there's spoilers in this video, so skip to the next timecode if you don't want to get any spoilers for Season 2 of JJK. Alright, I'm assuming you clicked off already. During the Shibuya arc, Nanami of course died, but he chose some pretty important last words. He knew what Yuji was capable of, and how much he grew in a short time. And also, he knew how Yuji would react to seeing him die, but he chose his words carefully. He expressed faith in Yuji. His last moments were spent encouraging him, knowing that he could handle this. He knew beforehand what Yuji was like, and despite being tough on him when he was learning the realities of being a sorcerer, in this moment he knew that Yuji would be reliable and that he did have what it takes. Sure, he might have not been fully developed as a sorcerer yet, but as any good mentor would, Nanami was able to see the potential within Yuji, and was confident that Yuji could exceed his expectations. But to go even further, there is another mentor that Yuji has, someone who you might not consider as a mentor at first, but he pretty perfectly fits the role. Todo. He 100% serves this role for Yuji. It's like what I mentioned with Gyro. The mentor doesn't necessarily need to be an actual teacher, or a really traditional mentor in any sense. In terms of class, he is Yuji's superior, but the two share an equal amount of respect for each other, as best friends and as quote-unquote brothers. Todo's character is basically meant to bring a sense of hope whenever he shows up. And without delving too far into spoilers, like manga stuff that hasn't appeared in the anime yet, you can clearly see that happens in every one of Todo's entrances. Even including the sports festival, multiple characters I've already mentioned fulfill this trait, notably characters like All Might or Goku, but JJK's mentor figures do a really good job at this. This of course applies to Gojo as well, with him being the strongest modern sorcerer and an all-around powerhouse. It applies to Todo, being a reassuring big brother figure, but also Nanami, a reliable grade 1 sorcerer with a notable presence. So to sum up, that's another aspect of a good mentor. A mentor should reassure their mentee, giving confidence and inspiring perseverance. By this point in the video, we've covered a lot of the traits I wanted to discuss already. As I've alluded to, these are just specific traits that I like in mentors. A character doesn't need to follow all of these traits to a T, and there are other things that make for good mentors. I don't want to just keep listing people and retreading the same ground, but I still think it's worthwhile to pick some more examples of characters that display a good portion of these traits. So I picked 2 more extra characters to cover that embody a lot of the traits I already mentioned. First, Izumi Curtis from Fullmetal Alchemist. This one will be more brief. She has the right mix of being friendly and being stern. She might seem terrifying to her students at points, but she is caring. She actually displays a lot of the traits I covered already. She's very involved and she is protective, but she doesn't coddle her students. She makes it clear that she's pretty powerful and experienced herself. And a lot of her experience and own knowledge that she imparts on her students comes from her own dark experiences in life. She also expresses her own principles that she's guided by, and uses them to guide her students too, notably with the belief that one is all and all is one. And this is what I mean, a great mentor doesn't have to embody every single trait that I mentioned, and a lot of them can overlap. Also, while this section was abridged, I did feel it was worth bringing her up because she is a really good mentor character. But I've saved one of my favorites for the end, Silver's Rayleigh from One Piece. I chose to end off on him because he embodies a lot of what I've already discussed here. Also, he is one of my favorite characters in One Piece. Not just because he fits this archetype really well, but honestly he's just a really cool character too. And it's a pretty high praise to say he's one of my favorite One Piece characters because look at how many characters this story has. Like, come on, that's pretty huge. Anyways, in my eyes he's another example of a pretty flawlessly written mentor character. There's so much about him to love. He became a mentor to Luffy during the most trying time in his life up to that point, and Luffy exited the other side as a much stronger pirate and a much stronger person in general. One of the best traits Rayleigh embodies is experience. And I'm not just talking in terms of combat experience, or how knowledgeable he is about things like hockey. From his introduction and even afterwards, it's very apparent that his life is full of rich stories thanks to his time in Roger's crew. In a world filled with so many mysteries and things to be discovered, he's one of the best resources of this info. And one of the only resources too. And for the most part, his experience is shown to us, not told to us. We don't just get an explanation that he's an amazing mentor for Luffy and a really knowledgeable guy, we get shown glimpses of Luffy's training, and right from when we're introduced to Rayleigh, it's really apparent that this guy knows what he's doing, plus the fact that he's really powerful. And we also do see a ton of glimpses of his early years. Usually it's not purely focused on him, but he's always present in these huge events, further showing us the fact that this guy's a huge wealth of knowledge. And more importantly, we get to see his experience through Luffy's growth post-time skip, seeing him become way more refined in multiple different ways. Not just in terms of his hockey usage, but just how he fights and goes about everything in general. He has a powerful presence on screen. He teaches from his own experience. He gives a sense of reassurance whenever he's around. He also has huge hopes for Luffy and has massive faith in him. Also being proud of the fact that he was his mentor at one point. He embodies so many of the traits I mentioned here and others too. All around, one of the best examples of a mentor character. To conclude, it's important to remember that these aspects don't all need to be followed. In a lot of cases, it's hard to have a lot of them together, and on top of that, there are definitely other aspects to good mentor characters. But I still feel like the ones I outlined are pretty important and can make for a great mentor character. These traits can be used as pieces to build a great mentor character. And I'm sure if you were to pick any random mentor character, you could find them expressing at least one of these traits to an extent. Of course, it varies series by series, depending on what the mentor is actually doing and who they're actually teaching. But overall, if you were to take away one thing from this video, it's noting how important these types of characters are. Often, they end up being some of the most interesting characters in the story, and some of the most crucial too. So I think it's worthwhile to pick apart what makes them work so well. Let me know what you thought below. And if you want a similar video like this, I did make one about the strongest archetype too. I'll link that above. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.